Late one night, Kenny Rogers received a 73-year-old stranger who said he had been trying to make this call for 40 years. The stranger explained that in the spring of 1974, backstage at a small concert venue in Nashville, Tennessee, Kenny had said 11 words to him, words Kenny had no memory of saying, and that those 11 words had led directly to 35 years of music teaching and hundreds of students who carried those words forward into their own lives. The stranger said, "I needed to tell you before I ran out of time." Kenny listened, and when the call ended, he sat alone in his house and thought about what 11 words, said without thinking, can do in 40 years. The phone had rung at an hour when phones should not ring, not the reasonable hour of a late evening call between people who know each other well enough to push slightly past the ordinary boundary of calling time, but the genuinely late hour of a house that has settled into quiet, and in which the sudden sound of a phone produces the specific disorientation of being recalled from wherever sleep or near sleep had taken you. Kenny answered with the reflexive alertness of someone who has learned, across decades of being someone whose phone might ring at any hour with any kind of news, to be immediately present when the phone demands it. He said, "Hello?" He waited. The voice on the other end was older, not the voice of a young person calling out of nervousness or impulse, but the voice of someone who had arrived at the age where the voice itself carries the evidence of the years. It was a careful voice, careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say, not to make it smooth, but to make sure they say it, who has thought about this call for long enough that the thinking has produced a kind of deliberateness in the speaking that is different from ordinary conversation. The voice said, "Is this Kenny Rogers?" Kenny said yes. The voice said, "I'm sorry to call so late. I've been sitting by this phone for 3 hours trying to decide if I was going to do this." Kenny said, "That's all right." The voice said, "I've been trying to call you for 40 years. I wasn't sure I'd ever do it, but tonight I did." Kenny held the phone. He had received calls across his career from people he did not know, from fans and from the specific category of people who exist at the edges of celebrity, who find ways to make contact that the ordinary infrastructure of public life is not designed to facilitate. He had developed across those years a specific quality of attention to unexpected calls, a way of listening that was simultaneously open and careful, that received what was being offered without committing to more than the receiving until the nature of what was being offered had become clear. He listened. He waited for what came next. The man said, "You won't know my name. You won't remember me. I wouldn't expect you to. What I want to tell you, what I've been wanting to tell you for 40 years, is about a night in the spring of 1974, a small concert venue in Nashville, Tennessee. You were backstage after the show." Kenny waited. He had played many concerts in Nashville in 1974, had been on the road for most of that year, moving through the specific geography of a touring career that took him from city to city with the regularity of a schedule built around the music rather than around any other consideration. He had no specific recollection of the night the man was describing. He said, "Go on." The man said, "I was 27 years old. I had been playing guitar since I was 12. 15 years of playing, in the specific way of someone for whom the instrument is not a hobby, but a necessity, the thing that says what the rest of life does not have language for. I had been wanting to be a musician since before I understood what wanting something meant." He paused. He said, "My father was a practical man. A good man, I want to be clear about that. A good man who had built something from nothing, and who believed, as good practical men tend to believe, that the things worth having in life are the things you can measure: a salary, a house, a retirement. He believed these things because they were true for him, because the life he had built on those foundations was a good life, a real life, and he wanted that life for his son. He wanted me to be safe." He said, "And what I wanted was to play music." Kenny listened. The story was not unfamiliar. He had heard versions of it across his career, in the various conversations that happen between performers and the people who come to see them perform, the accounts of people for whom the music had represented something that the rest of their lives had not provided.
the specific tension between what a person wants and what the people who love them believe the person should want, that tension was not unique to this man's story. But something in the quality of the telling held Kenny in a way that the familiarity of the territory might otherwise have prevented. The voice was specific. The details were exact. The man was not telling a general story about wanting to be a musician. He was telling his story with the precision of someone who has been carrying it for long enough that every element of it has been worn smooth by the carrying. The man continued. He said, "That night after your concert, the spring of 1974, Nashville, I was standing near the backstage entrance. I don't know what I was hoping for. I just didn't want the night to be over, because the night had been the kind of night that music can produce when it reaches you in the right place at the right time." He said, "And then you came out." Kenny said nothing. He was listening with the specific quality of attention that the story had produced in him, the awareness that something was coming, that the man had called at this hour and had been sitting by the phone for 3 hours and had waited 40 years, and that all of that waiting and sitting and reaching across 40 years was building towards something that he, Kenny, had apparently been part of without knowing it. The man said, "I stepped toward you. I don't know what gave me the nerve. I said, and I remember this exactly. I have remembered it exactly for 40 years. I said, 'Mr. Rogers, I want to be a musician, but my father says it's not a real life.' And you stopped. You looked at me, and you said, 'What do you want?' I said, 'I want to play music more than anything.' And you said, and this is what I have been carrying for 40 years, you said, 'Then go do it. Nobody else's permission is required.' 11 words. You said them and walked on. The exchange lasted 30 seconds. You had no reason to remember it. I have never forgotten a single word." Kenny held the phone. He was trying to remember. He could not remember. The night in Nashville in the spring of 1974 was not in the accessible part of his memory, was too long ago, too ordinary in the category of backstage encounters that a career produces, too brief to have registered at the time as anything more than what it was, a 30-second exchange with a young man who wanted to play music. He had said what he had said and had moved on, and the moving on had been immediate and complete. He had not thought about it after. He had not remembered the young man's face or his name or the specific quality of his wanting. He had said the words and gone on. The man said, "I went home that night and told my father I was going to play music. He was not pleased. It was a difficult conversation, the kind of conversation that fathers and sons have when they want different things for the same life. He said, and I want you to know that I have thought every year for 40 years about whether I made the right decision, about what my life would have been if I had chosen differently. He said, and I want you to know that I have never regretted it, not once, not for a single day. He said, I didn't become famous, I didn't make records. I played in small places for people who needed music in their lives. And in 1974, the same year I saw your concert, I started teaching children in the same town where I had stood backstage and asked you for permission. I taught music from 1974 to 2009, 35 years in the same classroom, in the same town, to the children and eventually the grandchildren of the people I had grown up with. He said, I had students who went on to do things I never did, students who made records and performed on stages and built careers in music, and every one of them, every single one, heard from me the same thing that you said to me backstage in 1974. Nobody else's permission is required.
Kenny sat in the quiet of his house in the late night and held the phone and did not say anything for a moment. He was thinking about 30 seconds, about the specific weight of 30 seconds, how little they are,
how completely they fail to register in the continuous flow of a life that is always moving toward the next thing, and how much they can contain when the person receiving them is in the specific condition of needing exactly what those 30 seconds provide. He had said 11 words because they were true, and because the young man had asked, and because there was nothing else to say that would have been more useful. He had said them without thinking about them afterward. He had not known they would be carried for 40 years. He had not known they would be passed on to a classroom full of children from 1974 to 2009 who would carry them further. He had not known that a 30-second conversation backstage in Nashville in the spring of 1974 would produce, through the specific alchemy of the right words at the right moment in the right ear, 35 years of music teachers and the students those teachers taught, and whatever those students would carry forward from the teaching. The man said, "I'm 73 years old. I retired last year after 35 years in the classroom. I have grandchildren who play instruments because I taught their parents, who taught them." He said, "And I need you to know that all of it began with what you said to me backstage in Nashville in the spring of 1974, that you were the person who gave me permission to do the thing I needed to do. And I know you don't remember it. I know it cost you nothing to say, but I needed to tell you, before I ran out of time to tell you, that it meant everything to me, and that it still does." Kenny said, "I don't remember the night." He said it directly, without apology, because the honesty of it was more respectful than the pretense of remembering would have been. He said, "I don't remember your face or your name or what I said." He said, "But I want you to know that what you've just told me, what you've been carrying for 40 years, and what you'd passed on to your students from 1974 to 2009, and what they will carry forward, that's not mine. That was always yours. I may have said 11 words, but you're the one who decided to believe them. You're the one who went home and had the hard conversation and made the hard choice and built 40 years of music from it. I said 11 words. You did everything else." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what to say to you for 40 years. I didn't expect you to say something like that to me." Kenny said, "Neither did I." They were both quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of two people who have arrived somewhere neither of them planned and who are taking a moment to understand where they are. Then the man said, "Thank you for answering." Kenny said, "Thank you for calling." The man said, "Good night." Kenny said, "Good night." The phone call ended. Kenny set the phone down. He sat in the quiet of his house and thought about 11 words. Go do it. Nobody else's permission is required. He had said them to a young man he did not remember in Nashville on an ordinary night in the spring of 1974 that had not registered as significant. The young man had carried them for 40 years, from 1974 when he was 27 years old and standing backstage after a concert, to the present when he was 73 and had spent 35 years teaching music in a classroom and had grandchildren who played instruments because of a chain of transmission that had begun with 11 words said in 30 seconds backstage in Nashville in the spring of 1974 that they will never remember. The words had traveled through 35 years of classrooms and instruments and children learning to play things for the first time. They had given permission to people who had not known they needed permission until the words arrived and named what they were waiting for. He had not known. He would never have known if the man had not called. The man had almost not called, had sat by the phone for 3 hours deciding whether to do it. He had done it because he was 73 and was running out of time to do it, and had decided that the doing of it mattered more than the uncertainty about how it would be received. And it had been received, and now Kenny knew. And the knowing was, he searched for the word and found it, it was enough, more than enough. The kind of enough that arrives when you discover that something you did without thinking, something you said in 30 seconds on an ordinary night in Nashville in the spring of 1974 that had traveled further than you could have imagined and had done more good than you had any reason to expect. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the words they say matter, even the ones they say without thinking, even the ones they forget the moment after, even the ones that cost them nothing and take 30 seconds and happen backstage at a concert in Nashville on an ordinary spring night in 1974 that they will never remember. Leave a comment below. Has someone ever said something to you that they have probably forgotten, but that you have carried ever since? And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the words that travel further than we know, the 30 seconds and the 40 years and the classrooms full of children playing music because someone once said, "Go do it. Nobody else's permission is required."